And welcome to the Minderoo Centre for Technology and Democracy and our latest event, Azeem Azhar Exponential. Thank you for joining us. I am Gina Neff. I'm the director of the Minderoo Centre, and we are so delighted to have you here both in person in Trinity Hall, Cambridge, and our online audience. Before we start the event, there are just a few housekeeping points here for our in-person audience. Emergency evacuation, we're not planning on any this evening. If the alarm bell sounds, all attendees should vacate the room immediately using the stairs, either the internal spiral staircase or the external staircase from Cherry Tree Court, and assemble on the Latham lawn. Smoking, except for smoking hot ideas, smoking, including e-cigarettes, is permitted outside the terrace room in the Cherry Tree Court, but is not permitted anywhere else. Exams, we kindly ask that delegates keep noise to a minimum and don't wander around the grounds, as our students are currently either revising or taking exams. I want to let you know that the event is being professionally live human captioned. If you would like to have captioning, you need to select it on the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Additionally, there's a stream text captioning for the event also available. This is a fully adjustable live transcription of the event in your browser. There's no reason why that's not available to people in the room, able to log on in the room. If you wanted to open this, the link is shared in the stream text. A transcript will be made available online after the event. The event will be recorded by Zoom and streamed to an audience on the platform. By attending the event, you are giving your consent to be included in the recording. The recording will be available on the Minderoo Centre for Technology and Democracy and CRASSH websites shortly after our event this evening. For those joining online, questions can be asked through the chat function, and our moderators will share the questions during our discussion. And for those of you in the room, when we get to this point in the evening, please raise your hand during the discussion, and I will listen to your questions. So please project, and then I'll repeat them so our online audience can hear them. So with that bit of housekeeping out of the way, I am pleased to be joined tonight by Azeem Azhar. Before I introduce him, I want to say a few words of gratitude for his joining us this evening. Azeem has a remarkable ability to create communities. I was introduced to Azeem when someone in university communications said, "We want you to do a podcast." And those of you who know me know I am very late to the podcast game. I only discovered podcasts in 2023. I'm really out of it when it comes to podcasts. And so when they said, we want you to do this podcast, I thought, oh, this is going to be a terrible waste of time. This is somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. And they said, no. He's a former FT journalist. Like, he's really good. Like, trust us. Okay. When was the last time you said to a university communications team, they said, trust us, and you trusted them, and it worked out. And so I get to this call, and lo and behold, we're talking what I found to be an incredible conversation that ends up being about Durkheim and self-tracking. And so, on the other side is this wonderful polymath who can talk fluently, both social science and technology and finance and business. Delightful conversation. And 2 weeks later, I'm at an event and someone says, "You sound really familiar." "Oh, right, I heard you on Azeem's podcast." And that's when I realized that Azeem Azhar has created an exceptional online community. And have been witness to that through the pandemic days and seeing how his exponential community has come together to support innovation, brainstorming, sharing. So now the formal introduction. Besides being a great all-around human and brilliant, Azeem Azhar is an entrepreneur, an investor, and author. He's the founder of Exponential View, the leading newsletter and podcast. Exponential View explores political economy of the exponential age, which we'll learn more about tonight. It reaches more than 200,000 readers around the world. He's also an active startup investor with investments in AI, work from home, and climate change. He's on the board of the Ada Lovelace Institute and sits on the World Economic Forum's Global Futures Council on Digital Economy and Society. Previously, he founded Peer Index, a big data analytics firm acquired in 2015. He has had senior roles in global media businesses and started his career as a journalist, where he was a writer for The Economist and The Guardian. In 2020, he co-authored The State of Climate Tech, a global analysis of venture capital trends and climate change investing with PwC. There's more.
Oh, sorry.
I'm the sorry one. Tonight, we're going to talk about his first book, Exponential, which explores the transition to the exponential age, and it was published in the autumn of 2021. A pretty difficult time to launch a book, so we're very, very lucky to be able to have a live in-person event here tonight. I will now hand over to Azeem. Join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Gina. Should I just come up this way?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Great. Well, no, thank you, Gina, for that amazing introduction. I think was probably written by my mum. And it's really, really wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be out and about. It's wonderful to have some sunshine as well. And as Gina said, the book came out in the fall of 2021 or the autumn. And it's actually the best time possible to write a book, because my plan in October 2019 was to spend December 2019 to May 2020 locked in my study. And it all went to plan in the end. So I was one of the few people who didn't get disrupted by the sort of change in work practices, as it were. What I'd like to do today, we'll just talk for about 25 minutes and then sort of move into a Q&A, is just run through some of the ideas in the book, which is here. I picked up the last copy in Heifers, I'm afraid, so I will be giving this out as a prize later because I left my copies at home. And the book has had quite a good reception, generally quite well critically reviewed, but I do have these two beautiful reviews from Amazon, which I love reading out. Left-wing slant. It is false advertising to sell a book without revealing the political bias of the author. Unless you love the political left, do not purchase this. And on he goes. And the other one was, it could have just been a couple of blogs, but stretching it into a book seems a bad idea. Substance is light. And you know, that's, I suppose, is the beauty of the internet, which is it's this wonderful canvas for all sorts of opinions. My editor, I think, particularly will disagree with this, because when I submitted the first draft, there were 1,300 citations in it. And he said that you can't put a book like this out with 1,300 citations. So curmudgeonly, I cut it down to 450. So the heart of the argument is that we're starting with a kind of couple of important axioms, which I know for the sort of sociologists and the political economists amongst you will be very familiar to you from your own work, which is that we live in a world of complex socio-technical systems. That is that the sort of political institutions or our communities work, the way technology networks work, are all rather interrelated, and that they don't follow sort of simple linearities. They're not like, for sake of argument, a couple of 100 yards of here, an apple falling from a tree and hitting the ground. There are lots of feedback loops, there are lots of lags, and they are quite complex to analyze. And the second is that, and this is really important, and I dispense with this in the introduction of the book, and I don't really return to it, which is that technology is not deterministic. So there has been, not amongst the researchers and the academics, but amongst the builders of technology, a belief really starting in the late 19th century, but it really accelerated in the mid 20th century, that technology was somehow deterministic, that it was a train upon which you had to leap, and if you didn't leap on that train, you'd be left behind. And that in itself is a sort of lifetime study to unpick that. But I start as a sort of given that technology isn't deterministic. It's something that we can shape and that we are shaped by. Which then takes us really to the overview of the argument, some of which I'll be able to get through when I'm talking. It's that we are at a moment in history that certainly is quite unique, where we have general purpose technologies that are improving at really, really dramatic and radical rates. I call them exponential general purpose technologies. And general purpose technologies are they're rare, they come along very infrequently. They're technologies that can be used in any part of our economies, in any part of a firm, and have quite often quite long-term second, third, and fourth order effects. A very good example of general purpose technology might be something like the steam engine or electricity, where the changes that were marked by electricity were not simply in one industry. They were really in the reconfiguration of how work operated, what cities looked like, the availability of labor at home, because we started to be freed of the cycle of dusk to dawn. And it's the other way around, isn't it? It's dawn to dusk when we get to work, unless we're vampires. And so a general purpose technology has these really dramatic shifts. And I argue that for the first time really since the turn of the 20th century, between 1890s and 1920s, we have a series of general purpose technologies that are coming to fruition. They create all sorts of new potentials, as surely as the internal combustion engine put into the car and the ship and the plane transformed industry and society. These technologies will transform industry and society as well. But the second is that the world in which we live in is governed by a set of institutions. Some of these institutions are very, very formal, and we need to fear them, like speed cameras and having to do our tax return every year. And some institutions are much less formal. They're sort of habits and norms and customs. But the institutions being sociological phenomenon, phenomena of groups of people coming together, will adapt more slowly. And that what that creates is this primary lens, which is the idea of the exponential gap. That on the one hand, we've got technologies that are improving dramatically, that will have impacts outside of their technological domain. And on the other hand, the world in which we live is adjust at this linear rate. And for me, the exponential gap captured that sense that we have probably been feeling, I would say, since, if you're American, probably since November 2016, and if you're British, since June 2016, that, God, can I use the word crap? God, it's all crap. Robots are going to take jobs. Uber drivers are sort of algorithmically managed within an inch of their life. Cybercrime is going crazy. Where does this all come from? And I see it as that gap. And my conclusion is that we need this systemic overhaul. So if we talk about the general purpose technologies, and I think it's really important to start with the technologies and an understanding about how they arise and why they change the way they do. The four general purpose technologies that I see as being dramatically important are, the first is the one we're most familiar with, which is the fields of computing and AI. And what those technologies are doing is that they are essentially making it increasingly cheap to perform calculations. As a way of understanding this is an Apple Watch that I apologize to anyone who studies the dangers of wearing fitness trackers, for example, but this Apple Watch was given to me for free when I got a new mobile phone a couple of years ago, which is how common they have now become. And yet it's more powerful than the most powerful supercomputers that governments used to use to model the weather only back 35 years ago. and it's now free. So you have this one technology, which is computing and AI. And many of us are familiar with it because of the idea of Moore's law. But there are three other areas which, where there are GPTs, I argue, that are emerging. A second is in the domain of biology, because biology over the past 25 or 30 years, because of breakthroughs in certain theories, has become much more of an engineered discipline. And we are now able to look at biology less of as a slow-moving, rather empirically driven experimental process, but more as something that looks like a high-throughput industrial system. And the technologies that are being developed in there that relate to gene sequencing, we're all familiar with that if we've had PCR tests, but also to gene editing, protein re-engineering, and cell engineering, are creating a whole set of new industrial processes. The third set of technologies are those that relate to new energies. So as distinct to the energy technologies of the sort of last industrial era, which was all these extractive fossil fuels, what we have are a set of technologies, particularly in the shape of solar, photovoltaic, which are becoming dramatically cheaper on an ongoing basis and have different industrial configurations, which I can talk to a little bit later, that have these second and third order effects. And the final most emerging technology is the technology of additive manufacturing. Actually, it's so emerging, I've really struggled to find a good emoji for it, which is why we have the factory. I've been struggling for 2 years on this. But additive manufacturing, again, is the realm of digitizing production. It's about being able to 3D print products, devices, components. A couple of years ago, it was too expensive to do that at any scale. But with the ongoing improvement in technology, we're getting to a point where it is cost competitive to 3D print useful components. And that, again, has really important economic ramifications. What is it about this idea of exponential, though? I mean, I think it's important to bring that forward. I talked about my Apple Watch, and we know how it was emblematic of the price of computing coming down, because that's what this idea of Moore's law is. Moore's law, which just says computers get more powerful every couple of years, is essentially saying computing gets cheaper. But what I noticed in the research that I had done, and some others, this is a friend of mine, Hannah Tucker, who puts this compilation together, that we were seeing these dramatic price declines across a whole range of different technology families, many of which we talked about in the previous slide. So, for example, the cost per watt of generating electricity through solar photovoltaics had declined from $5 to about 20 cents in 20 years. This is this blue line here. The cost to sequence a human genome was back in the year 2000, when Bill Clinton was president, at a more sort of innocent time, was about $1 billion to sequence a human genome. The price to sequence a human genome today is about 100, 200, couple of $100. The cost to store data has also collapsed, as anyone knows. I remember the very first USB key I was given was a sort of 8 megabyte key, and I now get regularly given keys that have got 1 terabyte, which is the sort of thousands of times more data on them. What does it mean when prices collapse? Because we may not feel it, because our iPhone has always cost us £600, regardless. But what it means is that within the economy, these capabilities get used and taken up much, much more. And then new complementary businesses emerge around them. If you think back to genome sequencing, at $1 billion a genome, only a handful of people will get their genome sequenced and get that insight about the things that might drive their health conditions. At $100 a genome, pretty much everyone could get their genome sequenced. I mean, not quite everyone, but I mean a very, very large number of people. As that price approaches $1, that means many more people can have their genome sequenced. And that means when you go to see your doctor, there's no reason why they can't use that data when they come to think about your treatments. So that, I think, is the important dynamic that we need to think about when we look at curves like this. It's about the expansion of possibility into the economy. Now, the other side of that, of course, is we don't necessarily know what complementary products and services will emerge. And so who would have known, go back to 1950 in the time machine and ask someone, and someone asks, what's the most surprising thing about the time in which you live today in 2020? And if you said to them, well, I have this device that is more powerful than all the computers on the planet and can access all of the knowledge of humanity. And what I do is I use it to watch videos of cats falling into buckets of paint. I mean, that is where we end up going once these capabilities get as cheap as they do. Perhaps I can put the sense of change just visually. So about 6 or 7 years ago, a new AI technique called generative adversarial networks came on the stage. Stunning technique, unbelievable. It was getting computers to draw images. So here we are, state of the art, 2016. The text prompt here is generate images of a pitcher, that's a baseball bowler, throwing a ball. And this is the best this thing could do. And it was mind-boggling. I mean, I gave lots of talks about this paper back then. Last week, AI system, given the text prompt, draw me a picture of Mount Everest as a cake in the style of digital art. And there we go. And that's the difference of 5 years of progress. Because one could also say, actually, where is the raw data from which you learn? Because we often hear that machine learning is about learning from data that already exists, where there is no Mount Everest of cake. So let's try to understand then what drives exponential technologies. And I really put it down to 3 fundamental drivers, that the most important of which is the first, which is learning. But also standardization and networks are important recent drivers for this ability for technologies that improve at 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% per annum for decades, which those technologies that I've discussed have been doing. So if we start with learning, the key insight here actually predates the modern digital computer industry, going back to 1936 and a man called Theodore Wright, who was looking at how engineers would construct aircraft. And he identified there was this relationship. And I'm going to perhaps bring it home to everyone. Did everyone here went into lockdown, obviously, except unless there's some real rule breakers, but keep it secret. Did anyone start to bake lockdown bread? If there are any hands up, okay, yeah, I know you did, yes, of course, yes, a couple of people baked lockdown bread. How was your first loaf of lockdown bread?
Quite flat.
Quite flat. Did you bake any more loaves?
Lots.
Get any better? Much. Right, Wright's law from the gentleman over here is essentially what happens. The first loaf of lockdown bread you produce is terrible, and you make loads of mess and you waste loads of flour. By the time you do it 8 times, you're much better, you're much more efficient. And that's effectively that curve. And it's called the learning curve. And complex engineered products often have learning effects. And these learning effects essentially say that for every doubling of cumulative capacity or doubling of cumulative outproduction of a product, there will be a learning that means the product is made more and more cheaply. And for certain types of products, like semiconductors, silicon chips, that learning rate is extremely high. And that drives the cost declines that we see across many of these industries. The reason I love that, by the way, because as you know, I've got this left-wing political bias according to that Amazon review. But I do have a bias because I'm a human and I was producing something, and that's what humans do. We embed our biases in, is that I think learning is such an important human characteristic, and it's such a social characteristic because we learn together individually in conversation. It's why we're gathered here today in Trinity Hall. And it is also the thing that sets the clock speed for the improvements in the exponential age, this learning rate. And we have we are getting better and better in many ways at walking down this learning curve. But there are a couple of other drivers of this sort of exponential age. The second is the idea of standardization. So if you think back to when you're at home and the batteries in the remote control run out, as they often do in our house, what you will do is you don't have any other batteries at home in your house. So you go to something you don't use very often, like your camera, and you rip the batteries out of them and you drop them into the remote control. The reason you can do that is because of standardization. Standardization enables larger markets for products, which creates better incentives for people to produce them, which reduces the cost. But it also means that learnings in one market transfer across to another market. And the hallmarks of industry in the last 60 or 70 years has been a dramatic increase in the number of standards that exist that allow systems to interoperate. When I first started work back in the early 90s, I used one of the early speech synthesis applications, and sorry, speech recognition, not speech synthesis, speech recognition, and it was, I mean, by modern standards, it was not very good, to be honest. But they had to build their own microphone and have their own software and have their own program, word processing program, because they couldn't plug into WordPerfect or Microsoft Word. We have a great speech recognition investor in the room at the moment. It was a Lanu and Husby system. But the point was that you had to build your entire thing. Today, because of standardization, because of these things called APIs that live in software, the guys who want to build, the team that wants to build speech recognition only needs to excel at speech recognition, and they can rely on standardization to deliver everything else they want. The impact of standardization is that it can accelerate the speed with which products can come to market, which drives that exponentiality. And one of my favorite examples of standardization has been in the space industry. So about a decade ago, a couple of academics from Berkeley University came up with a standard specification for a satellite, which they called the nanosat. They essentially said, look, if we make nanosats out of these kind of common Lego bricks that you can plug together, we can reduce the cost of building a satellite. And because those satellites have the same form factor, it will mean that the launch vehicles can be simpler and the cost of launches can come down. And you can go onto a website called nanosats.eu and you can look at the number of satellites launched year by year. And there's this curve, this exponential curve that ticks up in 2013 and goes crazy after that because standardization entered that industry. So standardization is really important. And then the third thing that's important is networks. And there are three that matter: that of finance, that of trade, and that of information. I go into more detail in the book. But the key thing about networks is that on the one hand, they make markets much bigger, which creates bigger opportunities. But on the second hand, they make information, knowledge, and learning travel much faster. So one of my favorite stories about this is a girl called Laura Connell, who is probably now about 20, 21. She was 17 when I met her at a science competition. And what she had done as part of her sort of second last year at high school and entered the science competition was built a working machine vision model that could look at scans of pap smears and determine more accurately than a typical doctor whether they were abnormal or not. There had been a cervical cancer scandal in Ireland a couple of years earlier, and so lots of high schools had sort of entered this tournament. And the fascinating thing was that Laura, who was not even from Dublin or Cork, from some really small town in Ireland, had never programmed a computer before. And her first program was this thing that outperformed a kind of typical consultant in a lab scale, right? Lab scale, not actually in a hospital. But the technologies she used had only been written up 3 years earlier at Stanford University, and actually hadn't gone through the full peer review process to get into a journal at the time, because the internet had, through its networks, had compressed the time it took to get that knowledge into the market. So those for me were the three drivers of this idea of the exponential age. And, you know, I felt, as someone who's been working in the tech industry for nearly 30 years, that people are very used to mostly men standing on stages very breathlessly saying, and one more thing, you know, this is going to change the world, or this is our greatest ever, and this will change the way you live. Well, you can remember things like the launch of the Segway that was going to change personal transportation, and, you know, a million other things. But what we need to do is we need to make sure that we don't get too skeptical. And so I went to a lot of trouble to try to explain why I think these processes happen, and to demonstrate in the first few chapters of the book that they actually do indeed happen. So if I've persuaded you, maybe I have, maybe I haven't. That then gets us to the sort of simple visualization, really, which is that you have these exponential technologies, and they through a process of combining and recombining and being taken on by organizations and by firms and by investors, become real, and they tend to accelerate in this way. And, you know, this curve, which, you know, it's a mathematical curve, but you can overlay it on top of the number of iPhone sales. You can overlay it on top of Netflix's revenues until this year, by the way. You can overlay it time and again on the current rate at which Norwegians are buying electric vehicles, and it maps pretty well. And what we have, of course, are these institutions, norms, and expectations that are changing at this sort of much more sedate, linear pace. It's practically flat if you ever watch the American Congress question Mark Zuckerberg and the other internet bosses. And I think the challenge that we have is to address the question about what happens in this space. And you know, there are two ways to I suppose to think about this, right? Is what can you do about this angle, this gradient and this rate of change, and what could you do about this, right? Is it a case of pushing this up? Is it a case of pulling this down? And in a way, that's what I try to address in the second half of the book. So, you know, this is such a busy slide, and I'm really sorry. I was told not to do busy slides, and I said there'll only be one, but this is just my one busy slide where I want to explain how this all comes about. So, you know, at the bottom layer, the lowest layer, you have the core technologies, and actually below these technologies are also sort of component technologies, which are in many cases, because of learning, because of standardization, because of networks, improving really rapidly. They can then be combined to build applications like AI and drones, which are also really improving dramatically. Think back to the baseball pitcher, to the cake, Mount Everest made of cake, which sounds delicious. And they then also find their way actually into the real world, you know, firms and business models. You can look at a company like Facebook, which frankly is probably not the most loved company in the world, now called Meta Platforms. And yet, despite coming under that degree of scrutiny, still grows and still elects to find new avenues in which to grow, because these firms are on that trajectory. And you also see it within how these things get deployed, frankly, amongst state actors. In particular, if we think about how you know, the use of cybercrime and disinformation has emanated from various state actors. But the second half of my argument then relates to what this exponential gap is, and the impact on our norms, our informal practice, our institutional arrangements. And, you know, perhaps one example of that in informal practice is you know, this is I think is a very tangible example of the exponential gap, which is one that I live with nearly every day. Should teenagers be allowed to use their smartphones at dinner? Mm-hmm. Now, when I grew up, no one used their phone at dinner because the phone was in the corridor. And if someone called you during dinner time, someone would be dispatched to grumpily say, we're having dinner, and hang up. And of course, phones have found their way suddenly into our homes many, many times over, and we still don't know what the rule ought to be. And of course, as we know, as the researchers you all are, our first assessment about whether these things are actually good for us or bad for us is often no more than reading the tea leaves, because it's not research, it's not academic, it's not been demonstrated. So we still don't know. Anyway, there's a tangible version. So then let's touch on my argument that this is systemic. You know, and I split this out into 5 big categories. The naivety of a first-time author. So I look at markets and the economy, and the trends that I see emerging in the exponential age are network effects, the growth of platforms that are dependent on intangibles. They are dependent on software, on patents, on creativity, on ideas, on the things that brains bring to the table. They're not dependent on closing off markets or extracting things from the ground or fashioning you know, bits of iron into pins sharper and sharper. In the area of labor, the trends that I see relate extensively towards the balance of power between these powerful firms and workers, specifically around how work gets managed and how work gets parceled out. As a brief spoiler, I'm not a big believer in the idea that sort of robots take jobs. Within the space of economic geography, the thing that I see and argued is that the trends of these technologies, even though these are trends of largely of centralization and the accretion of power to sort of central units and increasingly powerful firms, that the trends here of the technology force us towards a localization that is perhaps sits at counter to the globalization we've seen over the last 50 years. In the area of conflict, what I see is these technologies are very dual use, and they're not necessarily technologies of peace. They're actually more likely to be technologies of conflagration. And in the space of our democratic politics, you know, which we've all sort of lived through and felt the sort of the frustration of the social networks and so on, is the notion that our space for public discussion, but also other parts of our lives that we have kept out of the realm of the market. For example, the relationships we have with our friends are being taken over by privatized rule makers, that technology firms in particular have found their way into these personal interactions or into a space where we have felt that perhaps market rules shouldn't be the thing that that determine behavior. And, you know, I think about that in terms of, as, you know, the privatization of the publics. And the challenge with looking at all of this, and why I tried to get it in one book and on one slide, is that I think this requires a much broader conversation than a point-by-point conversation. That there are really close relationships between each of these areas. One of the themes that I think runs through all of this, but I didn't use this in the book because I didn't want to come across as someone who was super left-wing, which I obviously failed to do, is the current theme is really about the change in power. Shifts in power that are emerging in here. Who is it going from? Who is it going to? And it's not necessarily going from the powerless to the powerful, although there are trends like that. It's sometimes going from one powerful group to another powerful group. But that is one common theme that underlies it. So there's a lot in the book. I know that, but I hope that I've given you a sort of a good summary so far. Thank you. Thanks, Jamie.
Please.
Thanks, Gina.
As you are getting your questions together and the online audience is getting their questions together, I've got a few questions of my own. First, Azeem, thank you. That was great. And it's so great to have you here. So I'd love to pick up where you left us, because in the book, you talk about the new world disorder and this gap between where our technologies are and how they're growing and how our institutions are not growing, leads us to all kinds of problems. And as a sociologist, this really is what I'm very interested in. I think, writing there in 2019, 2020, you seem now almost prophetic in talking about the new wars, right? We find ourselves in a moment where there's a war in Europe, and it is a very different kind of war than we've seen in Europe before. My question really is, do you see the disorder that's coming from the exponential gap in our social institutions? Do you see this as permanent, or do you see this as a result of the gap? Like, can we ever catch up in our institutions?
Yeah, no, it's such a great question. And I've got a mic. And I would say in that chapter, I do have a big section on the Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drone, which, if anyone's been following the conflict in Europe, has been sort of one of the unsung heroes. Well, it's highly sung. There's even a song about it now, of the Ukrainian fight back against the invasion. So I think that that we do, part of the challenge with in the New World Disorder, we've sort of run through those ideas, was that the idea that any conflict is a balance between the costs to the aggressor and the benefits that they might see. And if you make the costs extremely high, the best example is mutually assured destruction, you stop aggression. If the costs get lower and lower, because you don't have to send soldiers to die, you can send a drone, or you can just constantly needle someone through cyber fraud and cybercrime, you construct this this moment where essentially you have a persistent set of sort of aggressions, and that's where that idea of new disorders comes about. And then the question is, how do you, and what's going on, of course, is that drone technology is making physical attacks cheaper and cyber crime is making it cheaper, but also we're much more vulnerable, because every time, I was never, until 2005, no one would ever consider that little old Azeem is a national entry point if you wanted to invade British infrastructure, right? You'd have to send ships and tanks somehow to us. But the moment I was connected permanently to the internet with a leased line, I was an entry point to the British network. And if you've ever bought a smart light bulb, you've created an entry point, a weakness for an adversary to get to you. So then the question is, well, what would it take for those sorts of things to be addressed? And I think we do have an adjustment period, rather than saying it's hopeless. The adjustment period comes from things like, let's look at IoT devices. It comes from saying, instead of Internet of Things devices being completely unregulated, anyone can sell them and no one has to worry about software updates or security updates and so on. We might start to say, well, if you are going to sell them, you can earn this badge of approval that says, we'll provide you with security updates. Now, that's an institutional change, right? That we can grab hold of. But then the same thing comes to our the institutions that we use to govern these types of issues. And what's been really interesting with the Russia-Ukraine thing, and some things I couldn't have predicted, is that the UN has not been very useful, but other institutions have been quite useful. The EU being one, but ones that we perhaps are not as obvious to us, like the Five Eyes. So Five Eyes is an international group of 5 countries: the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand. Apologies to any New Zealanders. And Five Eyes could only exist in the exponential age, because how else would you have spies in 5 different countries looking at data in real time? The same data. And so there are new institutions that can emerge, but they do take time. So I think we're in a period of needing to make those adjustments rather than hopelessly lost.
Another area of hope or hopelessness might be the impact on our notion of citizenship. So, you know, that sense of, you know, what is to be done is certainly mobilized and thought through how we experience the world in social media, and the kind of new word. And not only is it through our IoT devices that we can be brought in as ways that adversaries might reach us, but active disinformation campaigns, information operations, and misinformation and disinformation are ways to sow seeds of confusion and distrust and malcontent.
Yeah.
How do you frame the exponential age in terms of citizenship?
Well, you know, I think it's fascinating to see again what's happened with in Ukraine, because the Russians, who are meant to be great at misinformation and misdirection, have not been so good at that in the last sort of 2.5 months, and the Ukrainians have won the meme war, really just in remarkable ways. And I think it demonstrates that perhaps these tools need to be used as part of countering some of the strategies. A great example that predated that invasion was in Taiwan. They actually do have someone who is in charge of memes within the digital ministry. And they are doing a lot of memeing because they realize that that is the way to also communicate. And in a way, it's a bit like saying, well, Nixon was the first president to understand television. You know, who's the first president who understands memes? And that Zelensky, right? But so those are new tools that we end up needing. But I think there's another really interesting dynamic to this. And before I get there, I'm going to steer away the bit that I don't really understand. I don't quite understand why the US is so different to other places. I don't quite understand the dynamics of how, say, science skepticism emerged around COVID. And I'm reading it. I'm reading some of your colleagues as well on that. But you know, I think one thing that I think is quite interesting about prospects for citizenship are, where are the spaces for being active in you know, public policy, and what does the technology allow? And I'll give you an example. In power generation, for the last 100 years, power generation has been a very industrial process. Somewhere on the coast, for £1 billion, is a gas power station that pumps electricity in one direction. It's regulated nationally, and little you or me can have no real say and no sense of agency over that. And those decisions are taken very, very far away from us. But as some of these new technologies allow for very decentralized power generation. So in Cornwall, for example, there's a local electricity market, which is lots of people and farmers sticking solar panels on their houses, and now running into the governance problem, which is that there are things they want to do with the assets they own in their area that are regulated by some national market. That's an exponential gap as well. It's not as sexy, by the way, as saying democracy is going to die because of Facebook, but it's a really practical one. And it shows up in South Africa as well, where the cities like Cape Town are capable of generating loads of electricity because of renewables, but Eskom, which is sort of the national authority, is sort of working with a sort of a national plan. And what I think is interesting is this idea of the locus of democracy being able to emerge in new areas where we never thought we could participate as citizens. And I find that really particularly sort of you know, empowering idea, that together with my neighbors, what could be more democratic, what could be more participatory, what could be more citizen-like than that? We're sitting there discussing, you know, the energy supply and storage and what happens during the night and so on. And I think the technologies, because they don't cost £1 billion, they cost £2,000, enable that.
Change. I saw our first in-room question, and I'll just remind you, I need to repeat it for the online audience. So, Jochen.
I'll make it short. Thanks so much for this. It's good to hear a macro narrative, which is what I as an anthropologist struggle with a lot. Let's take the argument that you make as a given. There's an exponential gap, and it's been producible in this way. I feel troubled by the fact that and Gina, you said that as well, we need to catch up, the institutions need to catch up. How about we dampen this exponential growth somehow of these different technologies? And I want you to particularly say something about the actors that could intervene, and possibly, again, two specific ones. One, as a continental European, what's the role of the state in this? And the second one, which is what I do research on, what is not talked about enough is what are these venture capitalists doing and why are they not being held responsible?
So for those on the online audience, the question is, is it about dampening is it about bringing up the level of institutions or dampening the growth on the curve on the exponential technologies? Who are the actors, and specifically, what's the role of the state and what's the role of capital and venture capital?
Yeah, thank you. Really important question. One of the reasons I give these sort of underlying processes, right, of the learning curve and standardization, componentization, and networks is to identify that there are these underlying processes that are quite hard to avoid. The problem with knowledge, as Eve discovered, is that once it's out there, and it can't go back in. And so I think it's quite hard to slow those processes down. And I thought quite hard about this question in the sense of, well, you know, could you as a given state say, look, we're not going to allow these types of developments? And the problem is twofold. The first is in a competitive market, there's a good reason why everyone in Russia wants an iPhone rather than the Russian equivalent of an iPhone. And so you will be out competed in a way. I think there's a second reason, which is that these technologies are at some level tremendously beneficial. So for example, the carbon intensity of the UK economy is much lower now than it was 25 years ago and will continue to be because of computation and because of renewables. And because we don't know the answers today, we need to allow research and basic science to explore wherever it needs to get to. But that said, I think even if it's hard to change the gradient or the second derivative of that curve, we can actually shape that direction. So I think the weakness of showing it as a line is that actually it's not a line, it's also directed. And how does that direction get shaped? I think that direction gets shaped by values, and it gets shaped by storytelling and narrative. And we can participate in that. And one of the big shifts, I mean, just before I wrote this book, I wrote a big report on venture capital in climate change, where the amount of venture capital that was moving towards climate change was increasing dramatically. In the year since I wrote that report, proportionately, it more than doubled. But the real trigger point was Greta Thunberg, in a way, creating a narrative that somehow just removed just enough friction of belief that the climate narrative changed. So the way I think we shape what's important is through our narratives, through our disgust, through taking Frances Horgan and Christopher Wiley seriously, through starting to say, actually, Amazon workers should be allowed to unionize. And by creating those stories, the core technology, I think we generally benefit from, and that to me then is all about participation. And one message that I realized after I wrote the book is that, in a way, part of our democratic participation is actually caring about these things. In a sense, for a good 15 or 20 year period, we were just willing to be happy with faster iPhones, rather than having the discussion that we're now having. And in a way, it's, we are the custodians of this. Poacher's going to poach, and so we have to participate and ask those questions.
We have time maybe for one, possibly two more questions.
I'll give shorter answers, so I'm so long.
I saw Sarah's hand in the back.
Hi, thank you. It's worrying in a way, I think, that the same topic as the previous question and Gina's first question. And it comes from a point of naivety, because I'm not a sociologist. Yeah. But it was really very clear how you laid out the arguments. And so you've got technologies, and they grow exponentially because their drivers are the standardization networks. And you've got institutions, and they grow linearly because their drivers are. And then there was a kind of, I feel like there's a bind there. So the question is, what goes in that bind?
Sure.
Why are institutions not equally driven by learning standardization and networks? And in choosing those as your drivers, are you in fact obfuscating other drivers which institutions control precisely for very good reasons, which might limit their growth, but also for very good reasons?
What are the drivers of the growth of institutions, and what should we be doing about that? That was Sarah's question in a nutshell.
Great, actually, it's a great question, and I do tackle that institution question in chapter 3. I didn't quite put it into the slide, but I think that an institution can be designed in particular ways. Or one of the things we want from institutions is we want them to to have some sense of purpose and some sense of perhaps rigidity is the word that I'm after, or transparency and consistency, because otherwise they wouldn't be institutions. When it comes to the Latin word to stand, right, they would be fads or ephemera or crazes. But I think that there are things that you can do within institutions that relate to the missions that they have and their own ability to recognize the importance of change. And so one example there is that some of the regulators in the last 5 or 10 years have started to say, we're regulating an area like banking, but there's a lot of innovation that is coming through that is really good for consumers and really good for the unbanked, that the traditional banks can't do because of their own sort of issues. So what we'll do is we'll change our operations and create little sandboxes where new innovations can play while we learn about them. And it's and I think that is an institutional shift that changes the way the institution operates, that allows them to look at what this innovation is and to start to bring it on board with a slightly better understanding of the risks. Another model, and this is a Chinese model, is the model of saying, the phrase was sort of let the bullets fly, which is let experiments happen. And if we see things we don't like, we can come down quite quickly, which they did about 6 months after I wrote the book. Now, that may not work in our sort of democratic environment. So one of the pleas that I make, I talk a little bit about 3 design principles in the book that are flexibility. So starting with the assumption that things may change. And that is literally, how do you pack when you go to a holiday to Amsterdam or Belgium versus when you go to a holiday in the Seychelles, right? You pack a range of different clothes, whereas in the Seychelles you just take your swimmies. The second is resilience, which is how do you design an institution that is going to be able to withstand uncertainty on the downside. And we haven't generally, for the last 40 years, worried about resilience as a design parameter. We've worried about efficiency. And then the third, and I think the most important one, is this idea, and in fact, in this wonderful book that you've got on your desk, sorry for the online audience, the last essay is called Commoning. I thought about, I argue about commonality, because a lot of the issues that I raised were about the lack of participation and the lack of common goals in these arenas. And an institutional design that starts to think about collective-based approaches to what the questions are, I think secures the participation that you need to give it some sense of legitimacy and some sense of responsiveness. And one of the things, I mean, again, this is a mainstream book, so I couldn't get into the detail about this, but was that a lot of what we have to do is have had to deliver through institutions is so deeply technical that it's really, really hard for a non-expert to get into it. So that's why we have to ask them to be much more principles driven, because non-experts can understand principles, even if we don't understand sort of technical mechanisms. So I mean, I think your question is an absolutely really brilliant one. And hopefully my second book will answer it in more detail, but I think there are some principles that are in there.
That's a great setup for the next time we will invite you here. We are unfortunately at the end of our time today. I want to thank Azeem so much for joining us. Thank all of you for joining us both in person here in Cambridge, but also online. I'd like to call your attention to two of our upcoming events. Next week online, May 17th, we will host Lisa Parks. Lisa is a MacArthur Genius Award winner. She will provide an overview of her book in progress, Mixed Signals, Media Infrastructures and Globalization. It will be a wonderful add-on to tonight's event. And then on Friday, May 20th, we are hosting in person only Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower. She'll join us here in Cambridge to discuss trust in digital tech and big tech's role in national security. And that will be in conversation with me and Professor John Naughton at the Babbage Lecture Theater. So please look at our website for further events. For those of you joining us in the online audience, we would very much appreciate if you would fill out your short feedback questionnaire after the end of the session, and the link to that survey will be sent via Eventbrite, and that may come to those of you here in person too. Please give us feedback. We would appreciate it. And look at our events in the future on our website, mctd.ac.uk. Thank you all so much. Join me in thanking Azeem.